Welcome to NatRevMD, a podcast where we share tips on optimizing medical billing and improving practice efficiency so you can have the business of your dreams. I'm your host, Dr. Heather Signorelli, founder of NatRevMD. Let's get started. All right, doctors, imagine this. So you spend 50 minutes with the patient, you're managing their diabetes, their hypertension, COPD, whatever it is, and you're documenting the details. And so you decide it's appropriate to bill level 5, which is exactly what the AMA guidelines would allow. Now, weeks later, you get an EOB back and you get essentially a down payment or a down code from Cigna. Because basically their algorithm decided that your diagnostic code didn't look complex enough and that they didn't think it was worthy of the level 5 visit. So unfortunately, this is not hypothetical. This is actually really starting October 1st. Cigna is rolling out a policy that would automatically downcode your higher level visits, obviously cutting reimbursement, even if your documentation is solid and without even looking at medical records. So obviously we know some other payers that have started to dribble and doing this the last 6 to 8 months. We started pulling some records within our own company. Hasn't had a huge volume yet, but we anticipate this potentially increase. Obviously, some physicians in some states are actually saying this is unlawful. So welcome back to this week's NatRevMD podcast. I'm Dr. Heather Signorelli, founder of NatRevMD. We are a full-service medical billing company. And today we're unpacking Cigna's new downcoding policy. And we'll talk a little bit about why the California Medical Association is obviously fighting this and what it could mean for your practice and then how we manage this moving forward. So we'll talk a little bit about E&M coding just as a refresher, specifically kind of around that level 4 and level 5. We'll talk about role of ICD-10 codes and what guidelines are actually saying. So really by the end of this episode, we're hoping you'll walk away with not just some knowledge about some changes that are coming down the pipeline, but also tools to help you in your practice. All right, so let's first start with the policy itself. So Cigna is calling this policy R49. And again, so the short version is targeting physicians who bill higher level E&M visits, typically more often than their peers. And for those physicians, if the diagnostic code on those claims doesn't quote unquote justify the complexity, then Cigna is planning to automatically downcode your visit one level lower. So common codes or procedure codes, it's going to be that 99204, 99205, your established 99214s, 99215s, and then the 99244s and 99245s. So again, imagine you bill 99215 because you spent 45 minutes managing a complex patient who had multiple comorbidities, but your diagnostic code looks simple in their algorithm, then they are claiming that they're going to be dropping that to a 99214 for less reimbursement. Now, they will have a denial code that comes along with this. There's a couple different options that we're seeing as potential things that will come through. But then in order for you to get the 99215 reimbursement, you're going to have to appeal, sending in medical records and hopefully get that, overturned. We have seen other payers like Aetna and some other small payers starting to do this over the last 6 months. And some peers of ours who have appealed that have seen success with that appeal process, but obviously not ideal. Our own company, we haven't seen a huge volume of these. All right, so what does downcoding really mean? Obviously, downcoding is when a payer changes your claim to a lower cost service, which obviously pays you less than what you billed. And now often this is because the payer is actually disputing that higher level E&M code or says the diagnosis doesn't warrant it. Now, many times payers should be asking for medical records and then when they get the chart review, then making the decision. But increasingly what we're seeing and hearing is that payers are going to use these algorithms and not actually chart reviews in order to make these decisions. And so a COPD exacerbation visit billed as a 99215 could be changed despite the fact that they had time documented and also higher level MDM qualifications that would make it make sense for a level 5. So obviously, if this were left unchecked, right, if you're not appealing these, that is going to definitely impact your revenue, especially if you're a subspecialty that has a level 4, justifiably. And so important for you to understand a couple different things, which we'll go over before we kind of go into E&M coding and kind of what things you should be doing. Please note that the California Medical Association obviously is just as irritated as we are around this, and they've urged Cigna to withdraw the policy, saying it's unlawful, saying it's burdensome. I mean, how much can practices really take? Now, what they're saying is that under state law in California, payers are expected to follow nationally recognized coding guidelines, which AMA's 2021 E&M guidelines clearly state that you can bill based on time or medical decision making, which doesn't always tie directly to a specific diagnostic code. So obviously, CMA's point is well taken. You just can't replace a thorough review of documentation with a blunt algorithm that only looks at ICD-10 codes. So this is obviously going to ignore some of the complexity physicians face every day that you guys are having to manage in patient care. Obviously, they're right. Don't know where this is going to go yet, but hopefully they make some progress. Obviously, we all know that other payers may follow suit. We've seen a few payers who've been doing this over the last 6 months, very low volume of this so far. So I'm unsure how Cigna putting this into effect October 1st is going to impact volume of these. Obviously, we know that when several payers do this, more payers kind of catch on. Now, I wouldn't jump to conclusions. Don't go dropping payers yet. Let's see what the volume of this is. Let's see what they're going to be doing. But I think it does allow us an opportunity to talk through some important things that you'll want to make sure that you have right in your office. So, we all see increasing audits with regarding upcoding accusations or requests for medical records. Medicare has even tightened its documentation reviews in the past. Commercial payers are, of course, always requesting medical records. So really, really important that from an office perspective, a takeaway is that you sit down and make sure that any documentation, but let's focus on level 4, level 5 documentation is rock solid, right? So really making sure that your documentation aligns with the E&M coding guidelines so that if those records are requested, you can't appeal it, you can't overturn it, and you don't get flagged kind of as someone who is billing out a level 4, level 5 where your documentation doesn't match it. So let's talk a little bit about E&M coding and kind of go back to the basics a little bit. We have several talks on this. There are multiple different guides that you can search for. If you guys shoot us an email at info@natrevmd.com, we can shoot over an E&M coding sheet that we have. Again, AMA has these, multiple professional societies have them. But if you want a quick way, we're happy to send you the one that we have found online. It's not one we created, but it's one you guys can use. So for office and outpatient codes, obviously for E&M codes, right? So 99202 to 99215, you're going to be kind of making that decision on what level of code you pick based on 2 different areas, right? Medical decision making, MDM, or total time on the date of the encounter. And again, date of the encounter is really important here, right? So if you review records or you do other things before or after the visit on a different date of service, you can't include that total time. So you want to be able to make sure that you do all of that on the same date and that you're documenting specifically what was done. Don't round up on time here. This is not like just round up to 45 minutes. Write down exactly the time you spent. All right, so let's talk about medical decision making. Remember, that's kind of those 3 elements: number and complexity of problems addressed, amount or complexity of data reviewed, and then the risk of complications and or morbidity from management. So if you're a level 4, you're dealing with things like chronic illnesses, exacerbation, an undiagnosed new problem, really, things with uncertain prognosis or really an acute illness with systemic systems. And then for a level 5, that's severe. It's threatening life or bodily function. Think acute MI, acute respiratory failure, severe exacerbation of a chronic illness that you are managing, right? Very complex patient. And we can go into more details on these in another episode if we need a refresher. I do have some earlier podcasts. They're probably not as good from a podcast perspective, but the material is accurate. So we can link the show notes as to what episode that was. Okay, so time-based coding is just as important, right? So you'll want to document for 99214, 30 to 39 minutes, 99215, 40 to 54 minutes. And remember, that time includes not just face-to-face, but actually reviewing the test, documenting, communicating results, all of the physicians, but it has to be done during that day. Obviously, AAPC always says that they should rely on the documentation, right? Not just the diagnostic list. And so if you documented 50 minutes of complex management for an established patient, that's going to hit you that 99215, even if the diagnosis was diabetes, right, with hyperglycemia. And so this is where I think Cigna is trying to take some shortcuts and use the ICD-10 diagnostic code in order to determine whether or not it was a level 4 or level 5. I do want to mention about ICD-10 codes and how this all plays into things, right? So Obviously, we know the diagnostic codes don't define the E&M levels in this scenario. So we'll want to make sure, though, that your ICD-10s are accurate and are specific so that you don't get a denial. E&M coding, that level 4 or level 5 is really based on your documentation around MDM or time. So just, thinking about that, want to make sure that, when you are dropping those ICD-10s, though, to make them specific and make sure that it aligns with the documentation that you're putting in there. Now, really, really important to make sure that your note, right, has all of the information of what's going on, right? Did you have to speak to an endocrinologist or a nephrologist in order to kind of manage, if you're primary care, what's going on with the patient? Make sure all of that of who you talked to, how long you spent is all in there, especially if you are using time. You just want to make it crystal clear why you build that higher level. Where does this leave us and what is our advice and what we're going to be doing for our own clients? Obviously, reminding everybody, tighten documentation, spell out your MDM, the time spent, and how you hit those 2 out of 3 metrics if you're using MDM, or how you used time and where that time was spent. Obviously, any comorbidities addressed, everything, just document. You can consider doing a coding audit internally, especially if you haven't had one in a couple of years. Spot check those level 4, level 5 visits. Make sure that they have the necessary level of documentation in order to warrant that. We have an incredible coder who does our coding audits, who is available if you guys want to send in 20 charts. She's happy to review those and then give a coding education if necessary. Just reach out to info@NatRevMD.com. and just put in their coding audit. Now, obviously, we're going to want to set up an appeal process for us. For our denials, we put them on a denial tracker. We work with our certified coders as well as the practice to understand, when we need to be appealing those and making sure that, those appeals are managed. Obviously, we're then having to send in medical records. So making sure those medical records are a tip-top shape is really, really important. Last but not least, obviously advocate. Join your state or specialty society groups and recognize that many of these are starting to fight this battle on your behalf, which I think is probably the best way for us to manage this, right? Individual practices are going to struggle doing this alone. So join your societies and your states and make sure that they know that this is unlawful. It's not according to AMA guidelines when it comes to E&M coding. And we're not going to stand for it. Obviously, if you are looking for help around this, head on over to our website, NatRevMD.com, and check out our practice analysis. Happy to do an audit of your metrics and what's going on in your practice. All right. Thanks so much for listening. I appreciate the time, and we'll talk to you soon.